Elon Musk sat alone in his sprawling office, the glow of a distant fireplace casting flickering shadows across the room. It was December, and the holiday season's warmth was palpable in the world outside, a season meant for kindness, yet often revealing the sharp edges of society's divides. As he sipped his coffee, his mind wandered to the conversations that had been dominating headlines. Stories of inequality, judgment, and how even acts of charity could be tainted by prejudice filled his thoughts. What would it be like, Elon murmured to himself, to be unseen, to step into the shoes of the marginalized? The thought lingered, evolving from idle curiosity into an idea he couldn't shake. Christmas was a time for goodwill, but was that goodwill evenly distributed? Could the wealthy truly see the humanity in those less fortunate? He wanted answers, not through data or reports, but firsthand. That evening, Elon began planning his most unusual experiment yet. He scoured for a setting that would provide stark contrasts between appearances and intentions. A Christmas charity gala seemed perfect, a place where generosity should flow freely, yet where unspoken hierarchies might still dictate behavior. He resolved to attend, but not as himself. This wasn't about his fame or fortune, it was about blending into the crowd as one of society's forgotten. The next day, he enlisted the help of a professional makeup team. "Make me unrecognizable," he instructed, sitting still as the artists worked their magic. They added layers of wear and grime to his face, turning his normally vibrant features into a tired, weathered mask. A scruffy beard and cheap, ill-fitting clothing completed the transformation. He slipped on a tattered coat, its fraying edges brushing against the luxurious tiles of his home, a jarring contrast that gave him pause. Finally, Elon stood before a mirror. The man staring back at him wasn't the billionaire innovator who graced magazine covers. This was someone else entirely, a man the world might walk past without a second glance. A rush of emotions coursed through him: apprehension, curiosity, and a twinge of vulnerability. This is what it means to be invisible, he thought, taking a deep breath. As he stepped into the brisk December night, Elon felt a rare sense of anticipation. For once, he wasn't entering a world where people knew his name. He was stepping into the world of the unnoticed, ready to observe the truths that only anonymity could reveal. The grand hall stood as a beacon against the winter sky, its glowing lights casting a golden hue across the snowy street. Towering wreaths adorned the entrance, and the sound of a string quartet drifted faintly through the frosted glass doors. The Christmas charity gala was in full swing, its opulence a stark contrast to the cold world outside. Elon arrived early, joining a small group of homeless individuals huddled near the entrance. They were a mix of ages and backgrounds: an older man clutching a frayed scarf, a young woman with a toddler bundled tightly in her arms, and a middle-aged man whose calloused hands spoke of hard labor and harder times. Their eyes darted nervously toward the doors, a silent question hanging in the air. Would they truly be welcome? Elon struck up a conversation with the older man, whose name was Henry. His voice was gravelly, carrying the weight of years spent on the streets. "They say this place is for everyone," Henry said, his tone skeptical. "But I've been to enough of these to know how they look at us, like we're here to steal their fancy food." The young woman, Maria, nodded in agreement. "Sometimes I think they just want us to show up so they can feel good about themselves. They don't actually want to talk to us." Elon listened intently, his heart heavy with their words. These were people who lived on the margins, yet even in a space meant to celebrate generosity, they felt the sting of judgment. As the group moved closer to the entrance, a man in a pristine suit stepped forward, clipboard in hand. He was the gatekeeper, his polished demeanor cracking slightly as his eyes swept over Elon and the others. His smile was tight, forced. "Good evening," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. "Are you here for the event?" Henry hesitated, his posture stiffening. Elon stepped forward, offering a polite nod. "Yes, we're here for the charity dinner." The gatekeeper's eyes lingered on Elon's tattered coat and worn boots, his discomfort barely concealed. "Of course," he said finally, gesturing toward the door. "Please, this way." But as they passed, Elon caught the faintest mutter under the man's breath. "Let's hope they don't ruin the mood." The words stung, but Elon kept his expression neutral. Inside, the opulence was overwhelming. Chandeliers sparkled above tables laden with fine china and crystal glasses. The air was warm, filled with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine. Yet Elon couldn't shake the chill of the gatekeeper's gaze or the unease that clung to his companions. This was the heart of his experiment, and already the cracks were beginning to show. Inside the grand hall, the atmosphere was one of indulgence and celebration. A towering Christmas tree glittered with ornaments, its branches laden with twinkling lights and gold ribbons. Tables draped in pristine white cloths were adorned with elaborate floral arrangements, and the sound of a live piano rendition of Silent Night filled the room. Affluent guests mingled effortlessly, their designer attire shimmering under the glow of crystal chandeliers. Waitstaff moved with precision, balancing trays of champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres. Elon lingered near the entrance, staying close to the group he had arrived with. The sharp disparity between the two groups, those dressed in finery and those in worn, mismatched layers, was impossible to ignore. Wealthy attendees were greeted with warm smiles and effusive welcomes, while the homeless guests were directed to a separate section at the back of the room. "Please, this way," a server said, gesturing curtly toward a line of simple folding chairs set apart from the plush dining tables. Elon watched as a man named Jerome, a middle-aged black man with kind eyes and a quiet demeanor, hesitated before stepping forward. Dressed in a threadbare coat and scuffed shoes, he carried himself with dignity, despite the circumstances. As he approached the buffet, one of the servers intercepted him. "Hold on," the server said sharply, her tone dripping with disdain. "This line is for guests. You need to wait." Jerome looked confused. "I thought this was for everyone," he said, his voice calm but firm. The server crossed her arms, her gaze icy. "Well, not yet. We have to make sure there's enough for the donors first." Elon's stomach tightened as he observed the interaction. The dismissal wasn't just unkind, it was dehumanizing. Around them, other servers and guests pretended not to notice, their conversations continuing as though Jerome's presence were an unwelcome interruption. Elon fought the urge to step in, reminding himself of his role as an observer. Still, the moment burned into his memory, a stark reminder of the racism that could thrive even in spaces meant for generosity. Jerome eventually retreated, his head held high, but Elon could see the hurt in his eyes. Nearby, a group of affluent guests glanced at him, their murmurs barely concealed. One woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "Why do they even let them in here?" As Elon moved to join the others in the designated section, he felt a pang of unease. This event, draped in the facade of holiday cheer, was exposing deep-seated biases that no amount of tinsel or charity could hide. Elon sat quietly among the folding chairs, his gaze sweeping across the room. The orchestra began playing a lively rendition of Jingle Bells, but the music did little to mask the clear disparities in treatment. While the wealthy attendees dined on lavishly plated meals, filet mignon and artisanal sides, the homeless guests received modest portions of soup and bread. Even within the charity's framework, the divisions were glaring. When the servers finally brought food to the folding chairs, it was delivered hastily and without the warmth shown to the donors. A server placed a bowl of soup in front of an elderly woman sitting nearby, barely making eye contact before hurrying away. Elon noticed the portions were significantly smaller than what the other guests were enjoying. The elderly woman, whose name was Agnes, muttered under her breath. "They're feeding us scraps while they feast," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and resignation. Elon nodded subtly, feeling her frustration as his own. but his thoughts were interrupted by a commotion across the room. Maria, the young mother he had spoken to earlier, had approached a staff member near the buffet to ask for an extra piece of bread for her toddler. "I'm sorry, but that's all you're getting," the staff member said dismissively, not even looking up from her clipboard. "Please," Maria pressed, her tone polite but insistent. "It's for my son. He's still hungry." The staff member sighed heavily, her annoyance evident. "Look, you should be grateful for what you've been given. This isn't a soup kitchen." Maria's face flushed, but before she could respond, the staff member added coldly, "Why don't you just go sit down and stay in your place?" Elon felt his chest tighten with anger. The callousness was shocking, even in an environment that had already shown its flaws. Maria's hands trembled as she returned to her seat, tears welling in her eyes. Unable to stay silent, Elon leaned toward her. "You didn't deserve that," he said softly, his voice steady. "You're doing the best you can for your son. Don't let them make you feel small." Maria looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. But the humiliation lingered in her posture, her shoulders hunched as if shielding herself from further judgment. Elon's role as a silent observer weighed heavily on him. Every fiber of his being wanted to confront the staff member, to call out the hypocrisy of an event meant to celebrate kindness. But he held back, knowing the time for revelation would come later. For now, he absorbed the reality around him, the inequities, the biases, the moments of cruelty that revealed the charity's hollow core. This wasn't just an issue of class, it was a reflection of deeper societal failures, and Elon knew that when the time came to speak, he would have much to say. The hall buzzed with the sounds of clinking glasses and polite laughter as the event continued, its glittering facade barely masking the tension simmering beneath the surface. Elon stood near the back of the room, his senses keen to every interaction. Despite the festive decorations and cheerful music, the air felt heavy with division. It happened suddenly. A young homeless man, no older than 20, accidentally bumped into a wealthy donor while maneuvering through the crowd. The donor, a balding man in an expensive suit, turned sharply, his face twisting in indignation. "Watch where you're going!" the donor snapped, his voice loud enough to halt nearby conversations. "I'm sorry, sir," the young man stammered, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean to—" "Didn't mean to?" the donor interrupted, stepping closer. "Or were you trying to lift my wallet?" The accusation hung in the air, sharp and cutting. The young man froze, his hands instinctively raised in a defensive gesture. "I wasn't," he began, but the donor cut him off again. "People like you don't belong here," the donor sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is a charity event, not a free-for-all." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests nodded in silent agreement, while others looked away, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene. Elon felt his chest tighten as he scanned the room, noting the lack of action from the staff and attendees. Even in a space meant for generosity, judgment reigned supreme. Before Elon could step forward, a voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." The speaker was Sarah, a volunteer in her late 20s with a no-nonsense demeanor. She stepped between the donor and the young man, her expression firm but calm. "He said it was an accident," she continued, meeting the donor's glare without flinching. "There's no reason to accuse him of theft." The donor's face reddened. "And who are you to tell me how to handle this?" he demanded. "I'm someone who believes in treating people with respect," Sarah replied evenly. "If you're here to help, then act like it." A hush fell over the crowd as her words sank in. The young man looked at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and disbelief. The donor opened his mouth to retort but stopped, seemingly aware that the room's attention had turned against him. With a huff, he turned and stalked away, muttering under his breath. Sarah turned to the young man, her voice softening. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though his hands still trembled. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I didn't mean—" "You don't have to explain," she interrupted gently. "You deserve to be here as much as anyone else." Elon watched the exchange, his heart heavy yet hopeful. Sarah's courage stood in stark contrast to the crowd's apathy, a reminder that even in spaces of judgment, empathy could shine through. Her actions resonated deeply with him, fueling his determination to address the injustices he had witnessed. As the evening progressed, the charity leader took the stage, signaling the crowd to gather for the highly anticipated Christmas speech. The leader, a man in his 50s with an air of practiced charisma, adjusted the microphone and smiled warmly at the audience. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice smooth and polished. "Tonight we come together to celebrate the spirit of giving, to acknowledge the generosity of those who make events like this possible." The affluent guests erupted in applause, their enthusiasm echoing through the hall. Elon glanced at the section where the homeless attendees sat, their clapping subdued, their expressions guarded. The contrast was striking, a silent commentary on the divides that had been so apparent throughout the evening. The leader continued, his speech peppered with phrases about community and compassion. He praised the donors for their contributions, listing off figures and accomplishments with a tone that bordered on self-congratulatory. But as the speech progressed, Elon noticed a glaring omission. The people they claimed to help were barely mentioned. The leader's words seemed directed solely at the wealthy attendees, as though the homeless guests were invisible. Elon's gaze swept the room. The donors beamed, basking in the praise, while the homeless guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A man near Elon whispered to his neighbor, "Funny how they talk about generosity but don't practice it." As the leader reached the conclusion of his speech, his tone grew even more grandiose. "This season, let us remember the importance of giving back. Together, we can make a difference." The crowd burst into applause, the wealthy attendees rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Elon clapped politely, but his mind raced. The hypocrisy was palpable, words of unity delivered in a space rife with division. The applause felt hollow, a performance of generosity rather than its genuine expression. Elon glanced at Sarah, who stood at the edge of the crowd, her arms crossed and her expression thoughtful. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Elon knew he wasn't alone in seeing through the facade. As the applause died down and the leader stepped off the stage, Elon felt a surge of resolve. The night wasn't over, and his role as an observer was nearing its end. The truths he had witnessed demanded to be spoken, and soon the room would hear them. Elon sat quietly at the edge of the room, his thoughts heavy with everything he had witnessed. The image of Sarah standing up for the young man earlier played in his mind, a stark contrast to the indifference and hostility from others. It was time, he decided, to take the experiment one step further. Rising from his chair, he made his way to the buffet table, where the servers were busy replenishing platters for the wealthy attendees. The aroma of roasted meats and rich sauces filled the air as donors helped themselves to heaping portions, their laughter and conversation blending into the festive ambiance. Elon stood patiently in line, waiting for a server's attention. When it was his turn, he held up his empty plate and asked politely, "May I have a second serving?" The server, a young man in a neatly pressed uniform, frowned slightly. His eyes flicked over Elon's disheveled appearance before he replied curtly, "We're trying to make sure there's enough for everyone. 1 serving per person." Elon nodded calmly, but his eyes lingered on the plates of the wealthy guests nearby, piled high with second and even third helpings. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "But it seems others are getting more than 1 serving." The server shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if hoping someone else would step in. "That's different," he muttered. "They're, part of the event." "So am I," Elon replied simply, holding the server's gaze. A hush began to spread through the nearby crowd as people noticed the interaction. Whispers rippled through the room, their tone unmistakable. Who does he think he is? Why doesn't he just sit down? Elon heard someone mutter, "The audacity of some people." The server, now visibly flustered, waved him off. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't help you. Please step aside." Elon obliged, stepping back without argument, but the tension in the room was palpable. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, their judgment almost tangible. Some watched with amusement, others with disapproval, but very few with empathy. Returning to his seat, Elon caught Sarah's eye across the room. Her expression was a mixture of concern and quiet encouragement. The moment felt like a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone in the room. The discomfort he had stirred was intentional, a prelude to the truth he was about to unveil. Elon stood, his pulse steady, but his resolve unwavering. The room hummed with chatter, the incident at the buffet now a topic of whispered speculation. He took a deep breath and stepped toward the center of the hall, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The conversations began to quiet as people noticed him. Their curiosity piqued. He reached up and removed the battered hat that had been part of his disguise. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he peeled away the scruffy beard and wig that had concealed his identity. Gasps echoed through the hall as recognition spread like wildfire. The man who had been dismissed as a homeless guest was none other than Elon Musk. The room fell into a stunned silence. Wealthy donors, servers, and even the charity leader stood frozen, their faces a mix of disbelief and embarrassment. Elon scanned the crowd, his expression calm but resolute. "Yes," he began, his voice clear and measured. "It's me." He let the weight of his words settle before continuing. "Tonight, I came here not as the man you know from headlines, but as someone you wouldn't give a second glance to. I came here to see the truth behind this event, to understand how we treat those who have nothing." Elon's gaze swept across the room, pausing on the charity leader, the servers, and finally the attendees. "And what I saw was disappointing. I saw kindness from a few," he said, glancing briefly at Sarah. "But I also saw judgment, bias, and even outright discrimination, not just against me, but against others who came here tonight hoping for warmth and dignity." The silence grew heavier. Some guests avoided his eyes while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few murmured weak defenses, but they quickly quieted as Elon continued. This event was meant to celebrate generosity and unity, but instead, it exposed the divisions we still carry. People like Jerome and Maria, people who deserve compassion, were treated as inconveniences. The very people this charity claims to help were made to feel small, invisible, and unworthy. His voice softened, but his words carried even more weight. This isn't about pointing fingers. It's about asking ourselves hard questions. Are we truly practicing the kindness we preach? Are we using our privilege to uplift others, or are we simply using charity as a way to feel better about ourselves? The crowd listened intently, their earlier judgment replaced by introspection. Elon turned toward Sarah. "There are people like Sarah here tonight who remind us what real compassion looks like. She stood up for someone who was unfairly accused when no one else would. That's the kind of courage we need. Courage to see each other as equals, to treat each other with the dignity we all deserve." Finally, Elon addressed the entire room. The holiday season is about more than just giving. It's about understanding, connection, and humanity. Let's not forget that the people we help are not numbers or statistics. They are individuals with stories, struggles, and worth. As he stepped back, the room erupted into applause, not the polite, surface-level kind, but a genuine acknowledgement of the truth he had spoken. Some clapped with tears in their eyes, others with expressions of shame and resolve. Elon returned to his seat, his heart heavy but hopeful. The experiment was over, but its impact had only just begun. The applause lingered in the air, but as the reality of Elon Musk's words settled, the room began to fracture into pockets of emotion. Some of the wealthy attendees approached Elon directly, their faces flushed with embarrassment. A man in an expensive tailored suit offered a hesitant handshake. "I had no idea," he said, his voice faltering. "I've been blind to how we treat people. I'm sorry." Others, however, responded with defensiveness. A woman in a pearl necklace muttered to her companion, "This is all a stunt. Who does he think he is, lecturing us?" Her companion nodded, and they hurriedly left, avoiding eye contact with the growing number of attendees surrounding Elon. Sarah, the volunteer who had stood up for the young man earlier, watched from a distance. She was wiping down a table when Elon approached her, his expression warm. "You were the brightest light in this room tonight," Elon said, offering her a genuine smile. "You didn't need to know who I was to do the right thing. That takes courage." Sarah flushed. "I was just doing what anyone should have done," she replied, her voice humble. Elon shook his head. "If that were true, I wouldn't have needed to step in. Your actions spoke louder than anything I said tonight." As the conversations around them continued, Elon cleared his throat and addressed the remaining crowd. "I want to make sure tonight isn't just a moment we reflect on and forget. Change starts with action. That's why I'm donating $5 million to fund programs that create inclusive and dignified spaces for marginalized communities. This includes anti-racism initiatives within this very charity." The announcement rippled through the room, sparking murmurs of approval and surprise. For the homeless attendees, the moment was transformative. Jerome, who had been humiliated earlier, approached Elon with tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling, "for seeing us, for making them see us." Elon placed a hand on his shoulder. "You shouldn't have to fight to be seen. None of you should." Maria, the young mother, cradled her child as she joined the small group forming around Elon. "It's not just the money," she said quietly. "It's knowing someone cares enough to do something." Elon nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge of how far society still had to go. The homeless attendees, many of whom had arrived feeling invisible, left the event with a renewed sense of dignity and hope. For the first time, their voices had been amplified, their presence acknowledged in a space that had tried to diminish them. By morning, news of Elon Musk's Undercover experiment had gone viral. Social media platforms buzzed with debates about racism, classism, and performative charity. Hashtags like #TalkerTrueCharity and See the Unseen trended globally, sparking conversations that reached beyond the walls of the Grand Hall. Headlines captured the story's emotional core. Elon Musk unveils truths about charity and powerful experiment, and holiday event exposes hidden biases among the wealthy. While some lauded Elon's actions, others criticized the charity for its failures. The organization's leadership faced mounting pressure to address the disparities highlighted during the event. Inside his office a few days later, Elon reflected on the journey. He thought of Sarah, whose bravery had been a catalyst for change, and the faces of Jerome, Maria, and the others who had shown resilience in the face of judgment. This wasn't just about money or philanthropy. It was about shifting mindsets. The charity, under scrutiny, announced sweeping reforms. They launched mandatory training programs on empathy and equity for staff and volunteers. Sarah was invited to join as a consultant, her role centered on ensuring the charity's mission aligned with its practices. Months later, Elon visited one of the newly funded shelters, a modest but welcoming space alive with warmth and community. He sat at a long wooden table, sharing a simple meal of soup and bread with residents. Around him, the room buzzed with quiet conversations and laughter. A young boy approached Elon, his face shy but curious. "Are you the man from the Christmas story?" he asked, clutching a book he had been reading. Elon smiled, nodding. "I am. But the real heroes of that story are people like Sarah and the people here." As the boy returned to his seat, a soft rendition of "O Holy Night" played from a small speaker in the corner. Elon leaned back, savoring the moment. The room wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was filled with something far greater, a sense of shared humanity. As Christmas lights twinkled against the windows, Elon felt a quiet satisfaction. The experiment had been more than an unveiling of prejudice. It had been a step toward change. And in the simple warmth of that shelter, he was reminded that progress often starts with the smallest, most human acts of kindness. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more brutal.